Good morning, family, friends, and everyone here. I'm standing in the shadow of some giants. We're in a city that honors John DeSauvel, the black man who laid the first stone of Chicago greatness. But I also stand before you as the mayor of Brooklyn, Illinois, the first black incorporated town in the nation. Thank you. But today, we must speak a hard truth. The wealth gap we see today is not an accident of fate. It is a calculated inheritance. To understand why our pockets feel light today, we have to look at how the scales were tipped centuries ago. Not just in the deep South, but right here in the free soil of Illinois. While history books often point to Mississippi or Alabama, the truth is that slavery's shadow stretched all the way to the banks of the Mississippi River. Though black codes enforced indentured servitude, the system was designed to ensure that even when a black person was free, they were never truly allowed to prosper. To understand the spirit of Brooklyn, Illinois, we must first look across the river to where the shadow of slavery once loomed. In the early 1800s, to be an enslaved person was to be treated as property. Humanity stripped away and sold to the highest bidder. In 1829, Mother Priscilla Baltimore looked across the Mississippi River toward Illinois and led 11 families, a mix of horrors of Missouri slave state, on a perilous journey to the American bottoms. They named that new sanctuary Freedom Village. Even as slave catchers prowled the Illinois shore, the people of Brooklyn stood and watched when tragedy struck, when William Cowper was murdered in his own home. For protecting a fugitive, the community didn't break. Instead, they dug deeper. They built Quinn Chapel AM&E, where secret tunnels and passageways still exist as a testament to their work on the Underground Railroad. They proved that while the law might treat a person as shadow, no law could extinguish the divine spark of liberty. But looking through the eyes of Brooklyn, the village wasn't built on a gift. It was built on rebellion. It was founded by the formerly enslaved who crossed that river, not just to escape a whip, but to own their lives, their labor, and their land. We are the children of Priscilla Baltimore, a woman who saw a river as a gateway and a vision as a blueprint. At a time when the law said we weren't people, we built a government. At a time when the law said we couldn't own, we built a community. Yet, as Dr. King once reminded us, it is cruel just to tell a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. For generations, while others were given land grants and low interest loans, our ancestors in Brooklyn was navigating a system that actively worked to strip them of their equity. The wealth gap is the physical manifestation of those denied loans, restricted deeds, and stolen opportunities. But I am not here today to talk to you about what was taken from us. I'm here to talk to you and tell you what we are taking back. Brooklyn is not a museum of struggle. It is a laboratory of resilience. We close the gap, the wealth gap, by renaming it. We close it by investing with intention, not just spending our money, but circulating it. We close it by protecting our generational land so it stays in Black hands. We close it by teaching our children that they aren't just heirs to a struggle, but heirs to an empire building spirit. Brooklyn isn't looking for a handout. We're building a hand up. My experience of growing up in Brooklyn on Madison Street, that's now called the Mother Road of Route 66, for decades, the story of Brooklyn was told through the lens of what we lacked. They talked about the disinvestment. They talked about the silence of the tracks and the dust of the roads. They told a story of a town the world had forgotten. But I'm here to tell you that the ghosting is over. When we look around, our walls are finally moving. The signs are finally rising. For too long, the Mother Road, Route 66, acted like Brooklyn didn't exist. They mapped it, the journey, but skipped the soul. I want to mark your calendars. When we mark our calendars, I want to mark your calendars that on June 26th, on that day, we'll be celebrating the centennial of Route 66. And because of that day, we won't be just putting signs in the ground. We'll be putting Brooklyn back on the American map, where it always belonged. We are reclaiming our place on the Mother Road, and we are doing it loud and proud. That's just the beginning. We watched the railroads run through our backyards for a century, often leaving us with nothing but noise. But today, we have a partnership with that same railroad. We are moving past the decades of disinvestment into a new era of cleanup and expansion. We are making sure the industry that moved through Brooklyn now move with Brooklyn. So when people ask if our history matters, tell them to look at Quinn Chapel. That's just not a church with old bricks. We are restoring a sanctuary of freedom. We are opening those doors for tours so the world could see the fire that Priscilla Baltimore started. When people ask about how our future is funded, we tell them about the $2 million championed by Congresswoman Nikki Brzezinski for a new community center. A center that's just not a building, but it's a hub for our seniors, a classroom for our youth, and the heartbeat of the village. The world is finally tuning in. When KSD shared our Black History Month story, they weren't just reporting the past, they were witnessing a renaissance. So when people gather on June the 26th through June 28th for our homecoming reunion, we're gonna look at each other, our neighbors, and we're gonna realize that we weren't just celebrating that we survived, we'll be celebrating that we are advancing. The Web Gap was built over centuries, but we are closing it brick by brick, grant by grant, and sign by sign. Brooklyn isn't just a stop on the road for anymore. Brooklyn is the destination. When our children realize that their ancestors didn't just survive, they governed. So they will stop seeing history as a weight and start seeing it as a launching pad. The Web Gap is an American problem, but the solution starts in the streets of Chicago, in the streets of Brooklyn, where we are the legacy of those who crossed rivers. We are the descendants of those who built something out of nothing. And now it is our turn to build a future where our history is honored, our equity is secured, and our children will never, ever have to start from zero again. Thank you, and God bless you.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Greg Kelley, and I have the honor of serving as president of SEIU Healthcare, a local union here in Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, and Kansas, 90,000 workers. And it is a union primarily of Black workers and I'm proud to represent them. I want to first thank the members of ADCRC and, of course, Chairman Marvin Slaughter for having me here. And it's truly an honor to just be here in the space of giants and heroes like Dr. Darity. And I also want to acknowledge my dear sister Cleola, who is a mentor of mine and a giant in the labor movement. So I was asked to speak a bit today about the state of Black labor in the U.S., Jackie Algie. So I'll try to do that in the 10 minutes that I have. But I would say, in short, the state of labor in this country is abysmal. According to the Brookings Institute, in mid-2025 alone, 355,000 Black workers lost their jobs. Much of this job loss can be attributed to cuts made at the federal level of unionized workers. And has been widely reported, Black women have been disproportionately impacted by these federal cuts, leading to a nearly 33% decline in federal employment for Black women in just over a year. And for my union, which represents a number of federal workers at the VA system, the job loss has been significant. And it has gotten worse as this administration has sought to lead a mass exodus of workers, both voluntarily and involuntarily. And so we are in a moment of crisis in Black labor and amongst Black workers. And it isn't simply just because of unemployment, and it rightly gets its own attention, but the issue of underemployment and low wages has also disproportionately impacted Black workers. Again, my union, SEIU Healthcare, is a union of care workers who started coming together back in the 80s. They were home care workers, Black women, 7 of them, who had no right to form a union. They had no benefits to speak of. They were called sub-minimum wage workers, and some of them made as little as $1 an hour. In fact, they didn't even have the right to form a union because they were excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act, meaning that they didn't make a minimum wage and they didn't have overtime, nor any of the federal protections. And so this system existed for decades until those workers right here in Chicago came together and decided that they wanted to form what is now SEIU Healthcare. And so the loss of wealth that those workers who tens of thousands over decades lost screams for reparation. We believe that as a labor union, our fundamental job is to correct wrongs. And in fact, that repair is what we try to talk about all the time as a labor union. And in fact, it is because of the work that they do and the people that they are that they were excluded from those protections. This exclusion, of course, was baked in decades ago and has had a lasting impact on these workers generations later. Seen through an historical lens, undervalued workers have relied on unions to create pathways to income and wealth growth. And so in my own personal experience, I can refer to my dad, who was a Vietnam veteran who came back to Chicago in the early 70s. And like many of his cohort who had served and were drafted into Vietnam, they came back looking for work. And in my father's case, he worked at Cook County Jail. And if you've been around Chicago long enough, you know that back in that time, there were 2 different jails in Chicago. There was the Cook County Jail, and there was the City of Chicago Jail. My dad worked for the county jail, which many of his cohort Black veterans worked at. There was no union there. And so my dad, along with his cohort, formed the first union of correctional officers at Cook County. And so that history is important because, in fact, today, most folks know that people that work for Cook County, you get a job working at the county jail, you've got a pretty good job. And in my case, it was because of that union job that we bought our first house that we still own to this day. I was able to go to college, my siblings also as well, but it was that union difference that provided us with a path forward. And so for us, again, repair requires organizing. Unions have a fundamental role in making sure that those things are repaired. And so as I close, I get out of the way, I would argue that organizing workers and supporting unions are key to addressing the systemic inequities that continue to disproportionately impact Black Americans, repairing the damage caused by slavery, Jim Crow, and discrimination will require many different strategies. And in my view, making it easier to join a union is an important strategy. Black labor's more important than ever. And if we want to decrease wealth disparities, organizing more workers into unions is one proven method of doing it. We should all do all we can to support unions and make sure that it's easier for workers to join unions, regardless of the type of work that they do. Doesn't matter whether you have a blue collar, a pink collar, or no collar at all. The trades have their role to play, but those are limited jobs. There are only a few thousand of those at a time. But healthcare jobs, service sector jobs, there are millions of them. And if we really want to change the wealth gap, increase the income of working people, millions of working people, we need to make sure that they all have an opportunity to be in the union. And a major component of repair for Black communities must include making it easier for all workers to join a union regardless of their job. Thank you.